Hello, I'm Malcolm Cox, and this is your Tuesday teaching tip. These are tips to help us to prepare a Bible lesson, a sermon, or some other teaching opportunity. These tips come from friends of mine, from books I've read, and some are my own experimentation. They're certainly not the way to prepare a lesson, they're just a way, but I do hope you'll try them and see how they work for you. This week is episode number 12, and we're talking about audience anticipation. What does that mean? Well, watch on. Audience anticipation. What's this about? Well, we've got our points, we've examined the text, we've got our illustrations. Now it's time to consider, if we haven't already done so, who are we actually speaking to? When we look at Jesus, we see that he was thinking about his audience. He used illustrations and topics that were common. In Luke, he talks about a tower that's fallen on people that was common knowledge. He uses illustrations to do with tax collectors and farmers, things that they would have understood. He knew his audience. Do we? Sometimes we neglect this, and that's a shame because then we fail to connect. After all this hard work we've done preparing a passage, surely we want to make sure we connect. Here are some things to consider. Firstly, the life situation of the people in the congregation or your audience. In other words, are they mostly teenagers, singles, married, parents, older people? What's the mix? If it's a complete mix, then we alter our illustrations and our points to make sure that we cover everybody the best we can. What about their education level? Remember, we're not trying to impress people, but to inspire and influence them. I'm a classical musician by training, and I would love to be able to use lots of technical musical illustrations because they mean a lot to me. I mean, I have a particular favourite opera. I love opera. And my favourite is by a French composer called Hector Berlioz. And most of you have never heard of Berlioz. That's okay. His best opera, in my opinion, was Les Troyens, the Trojans. And in that, there's a character called Aeneas who's struggling with his God-given destiny and the cost involved of whether he can keep his relationship with Queen Dido or whether he has to give that up because God has called him to go to Italy. And that struggle, I relate to that struggle, and I could bring it into this passage in Matthew chapter 8 with the struggle of the man of, I want to go and bury my father. But Jesus is saying, follow me, and he has to make a decision. The thing is, I've probably lost all of you long ago because you maybe are not interested in opera, you don't know who Aeneas is, and you don't care about Hector Berlioz and the Trojans. Oh well, never mind. We moderate our illustrations and our points according to the level of education and understanding of our audience. What about language and origin of the people we're speaking to? Do you have many non-English speakers in your congregation? If you do, or perhaps English is not their first language, then you might need to simplify your language and your ideas. You might need to choose illustrations that are broader and not specific to your own culture. It's interesting, on Sunday I was preaching and I used the illustration that's in episode 11 of these recordings about my toaster, and you'll have to look at that to get the background. And I shared the story about my toaster and breakfast, and a Brazilian man came up to me afterwards and said he really appreciated my sermon and he got the point about the toaster, but he said, you know what? He said, that wouldn't happen in Brazil. And I said, why not? He said, well, we don't eat toast for breakfast in Brazil. And so he wouldn't appreciate the finer virtues of toast with marmalade. Anyway, it's a whole other story. But it was interesting to me to realize, yes, okay, he did get the point of the illustration, but toast for breakfast is not something he's familiar with. Do we need to consider such things? The gender ratio in the group we're talking to, is it mostly men, mostly women? Will our illustrations connect? I preached Matthew 8 a little while ago, and I used 2 football illustrations in the sermon. That's soccer for my American cousins. I used 2 sports illustrations in one sermon, and I think I lost some of the women. Not to say women aren't interested in soccer, but, generally speaking, I think the men are more connected with that. And 2 illustrations about the same kind of thing is probably too many. What about the average age of the people in terms of their spiritual age, their Christian age? It makes a big difference to how much we need to explain. For example, in Matthew chapter 8, when the man says, I need to go and bury my father, and Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead, would your audience be familiar with the other instructions of Jesus in Matthew about family? For example, in Matthew chapter 10, where he talks about, I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Would they be familiar with that? Or later on in Matthew chapter 12, when Jesus' mother and brothers are there, and he says, who are my mother and my brothers? And he points to his disciples and says, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever follows me is my mother and my brother and sister. Would they know that? If they would know that, you might refer to it and say, you remember he said that? But if your audience are fairly young Christians, you might have to turn to that passage if you want them to fully grasp it. Is it a question of reminding or actually teaching? That makes a big difference. What about the religious background of the people you're speaking to? Do they have a largely atheist background before they became Christians, or do they come from a more or less Christian tradition? That makes a big difference too. I was speaking to a friend of mine in India recently who reminded me that there are many people that they baptize in our churches in India who've never heard of Moses. And we might think that was somewhat shocking, but actually, of course there'll be lots of people who've never heard of Moses, and you don't have to have heard of Moses to become a Christian. Now, then they educate them about Moses, but if I'm speaking to a group of people who've never heard of Moses, and I talk about him and other characters from the Old Testament that they're clueless about, that's not going to help them to connect with the points that we're making. So these are matters to consider. Our audience, we've got to anticipate our audience so that we will properly connect with them. Now, I know what some of us are thinking and feeling right now, that this is a bit overwhelming. Am I saying that we have to make a point that will apply to every single person? We have to connect with every single person. You might have a crowd of 100 or 1,000. We can't possibly anticipate every situation for every person in our audience. No, that's not what we're talking about here. But we're at least looking at the big picture. Taking time to think about whether I'm just using points and illustrations that fit my life situation, or am I thinking about and being concerned to make sure that I do my best to connect with the people that God has called me to speak to. So as we look at our passage in Matthew chapter 8 and the two people who want to or say they will follow Jesus, and we look at the disciples in the boat and the storm and the peace of Jesus and the power of Jesus, we ask ourselves, how can I make this applicable to people who are single, to people who are teenagers, to people who are married or parents or older? How can I make sure that I communicate the best way I can a message that will stir the heart of all the people that God has put in front of me this day? I don't think congregations are unreasonable. They won't expect us to hit every point for every person. But they really will notice and appreciate when it's clear that we've thought about it and made our best efforts. And then they'll forgive us for our shortcomings. And we need that grace. Amen. So, there you have it. Audience anticipation. Please try some of these tips and let me know how it goes. And if you've got some of your own tips you'd like me to share, or comments or questions, then please send them to malcolm.cox@iccmissions.org. I'd love to hear from you. Come back next week when we'll have another Tuesday teaching tip. And until then, I hope you have a tremendous Tuesday and a wonderful week. God bless.